Okay, so this demo is going to be about how to use the automated table of contents in your book. I put together a example, just kind of a no graphics, purely typography based book, just typesetting a book in 8.5 by 11 spread format, 24 page saddle sit self cover. It's got 4 sections here in my demo book, and I've got just a cover style. And I've gone through and I've done what some of you might have done when you're working on a book, and just styled things up. And just as a side note, my 2 pugs, Gigi and Biggs, are joining me for this meeting. They're sitting in my extra office chair here, so they'll be adding some nice background sounds of soothing pug sounds, so that can pepper this demo with some interesting background audio. But anyways, so this is what you might do. You might go through and style up your title, go through and say, okay, well, my section 1, whatever that's called, it's got a title. And I'm going to go through and manually just put that in there. I've got my diligently gone through and made my table of contents heading 1 and all this sort of stuff. And then somebody comes along and changes your book. And you might think, well, I guess I'm just going to have to manually go through and find all these subsections. But, let's go through this copy here. I've just used lorem ipsum just to put together a pretty standard, random sort of number of pages with basically a title, a heading. I had, an H2 subheading and then even subheadings under there. And these things are the type of things that can very typically change a lot, especially if it's a type-heavy document like a newsletter or something like that where edits happen all the time. So, once we start to get into a larger book, we really do not want to be doing our table of contents manually. That's Bush League stuff. You'll be spending hours doing that, and every one of your revs is going to take a long time. But InDesign to the rescue with the automated table of contents, which is found up here under the layout function, table of contents. The problem with the table of contents, not super intuitive as to how it works, but that's what this demo is all about. I'm going to walk you through how to use it. And there's actually a couple of different ways to use it, depending on the situation and what you want to do. So what's pretty typical is I don't want my table of contents paragraph styles. Let's go back to that page. I don't want all the spacing and the tabs and all that sort of stuff. I don't want that to follow the rules of my actual page content styling. Where I've got these headers that span columns and this. These styles are specific to my layout. They're not necessarily going to work in my table of contents. So I'm going to go through and I'm going to sort of show you what sort of happens if you just use the table of contents kind of as it looks out of the box, and then kind of go through the maybe less intuitive things. So this is just a text object with text that I've manually put in here, but I have defined all these styles separately ahead of time in my paragraph style. So I've made these separate TOC title, which is here. I've got my TOC H1, which is there, H2 there, and H3 there, where I've set all my tab settings and all the rest of it. But we're not going to use this manual thing. I'm going to go to my layout, and I'm going to go and define my table of contents. So what you're going to get is you're going to get this dialog that asks you to create, a style. So if you haven't created one, it's going to say default. So you can go through and you can say, if you're using a book, include book documents. So that's going to now go through and it's going to scan the whole composition, the whole book for these various paragraph styles. So styles to use in your table of contents include paragraph styles. Okay, so you can go through your styles that are available, and I've synchronized these between my documents, right? So I've used H1 section title, so that's obviously my top level section. And then I've also used this H2 subsection title add, and I've got a third subsection. That's great. So that's going to go through and automatically find all those titles, but it's going to use the paragraph styling that I've put in place, right? So you can see for each one of these, at each level, there's this next section, how you determine how that kind of operates within your table of contents design. So you can see that H1 is at level 1. You can pick various levels through your structure, but it does this automatically. You can rearrange these as you like, but typically it makes sense to follow the 1, 2, 3 logic. That's what your Google Doc is going to follow. That's what HTML contents are going to follow. H1 through 3 at a minimum. That's pretty typical. Okay, so if we just said same style, that's just going to use whatever that paragraph definition style is. We can I'm going to just show what that'll look like, and we'll see why we don't want that typically, but we can come back and redefine this after. But I'm just going to leave it as the default in the same style right now. Page number, after entry, before entry, or no page number. Like, do I maybe want to say what section that is? Yeah, I think I do, after entry. And I'm going to use after entry. And you can pick what style you want. Okay, so I haven't made a page number style yet for my table of contents. This draws from your character styles. You can create a new one right now if you want to. Kind of come back and define that later. You can also choose what we put between the entry and the number. So typically this is the tab by default, but you can use other things if you want, just, you know, M dash, M space, whatever. There's different things you can do to sort of separate out your table of content according to the style that you want, but I'm just going to use the default, which is a tab. And I have created a corresponding character style, which is that dotted underline. It's a little thicker for the H1. Just going to apply that there. And everything else is pretty much what we want. You know, we're going to get into this include text on hidden layers thing down in the sort of part 2 of this. But anyways, at the basic level, this is what we're going to see for our H1. So using the same style, put the number after it, and then, you know, put a tab in between that and the number, and then apply the style to that to give it the underline. Do the same thing for H2. Okay, so it's just H2 underline with tab after entry. Yep. And same thing after entry. And I'm just going to use the same H2 underline for my H3s on level 3. Okay, so then what do we want to call it? I'm going to say table of contents. I had made myself a table of contents title, paragraph style, so I'm going to apply that. I can save the style, but it's just going to save as my default, so I'm going to hit OK. And do I want to set overset text? Yeah. I don't think I have any. So it's just like, now it's asking you to define a text block, a text object, but this text object now is going to automatically include all of that content that's tagged with those paragraphs. So, you know, my tab settings and everything kind of look like crap, doesn't really fit, you know, it doesn't really work, right? Out of the gate, that's the assumption. You're like, that's not what I was expecting. So if you don't want to go through and redefine all of your paragraph styles throughout your book, because those are specific to the layout. So that's what that don't use the same style. It's pretty rare that you'd ever want to use the same style. In a really basic document, maybe you get away with it, but most of the time, no, we can't. So we're going to go back to our layout, and we're going to go to our table of contents again. And now we're going to pick my table of contents style. So these are restyled versions that are set up specifically just to style it. So H1, instead of same style, I'm going to go TOC H1. And then same for this, TOC H2. Now these are all styles that I've defined. I'm assuming that you guys have watched the other tutorials about how to define paragraph styles. So I've pre-built these so that I don't cover the same ground over and over again. And TO3 H3. Okay, so that's going to go through and replace all of those styles with these styles. So that's starting to look a little better. That's starting to line up, right? Now the one thing that I forgot to do is my H3 stuff, my TO3 H3, I forgot to define the tab for that one, so it doesn't line up in the same place. But also, a lot of these H3s are pretty long. So I'm going to probably remove the H3. I don't think I need the H3s in my content. That's just a design choice based on the type of content I'm using, placeholder. And often an H3 in your content would be something long like that. Doesn't really belong in your table of contents. So back to my table of contents style. And I'm just going to remove this from it. Okay, so now that's gone through and removed all those H3s and has now just gone through and automatically numbered my top level titles for my various sections throughout my book. Okay, and also gone through and found anything that's tagged with the H2. You know, my tabs styling here is not working super well because it's getting a little crowded. So again, back to my layout. Update my table of contents. Now we're going to change the, well, we don't need to go to the table of contents to do this. We can actually do this with our paragraph styles. We can now just go back to paragraph styles and modify the tab settings for my various TOC heading styles that I'm using, right? So I just want to, let's say I want to pop my H1 level out to 7 inches. Well, hang on, I'm just going to undo that because I didn't mean to have, you got to make sure you don't have the text object. I was going to apply the style when you edit it. So I'm going to go to my TOC H1 and I'm going to go to my tabs and I'm going to put in a tab at 7 inches. Typically easier to tab that in. It's a right tab that's going to align the type all on the tab. So that's going to bump all those out there. Same thing now for my TOC H2. And maybe I want to put that out to, you know, a little bit sub to that, maybe 6.5. Or I could line them all up. That's kind of a stylistic choice. Okay, so why did that not apply? Let's go take a look. Did I? Oh, because I've already had this one tab in there, so I'm going to get rid of that because it's just the one tab space. There we go. That's looking kind of actually a little more scattered than I'd like. I think I'd like everything to line up nicely, so I'm just going to go back to that H2 definition and just put that to 7. Okay, so now everything lines up. You know, I could then go through and say, all right, well, I want to change the color, all these sorts of things. Well, that's going through and modifying the related character styles in your table of contents. So let's say I wanted to change the color of my page number for my H2. So I'm going to go down to my H2 and then I'm going to go to the page number section style here where it says style none. I'm going to define a new character style. I'm just going to call that H2 or TOC H2 page number. And I'm going to change that to this lovely shade of RGB magenta in my default color palette. I'll do fine. Make sure that's actually saved. Okay, so that automatically goes through and does that. So at the very basics, that's really the power of using an automated table of contents. If I go through now and go to any one section, move a section around, say I wanted to move this whole hipster Ibsen section becomes section 3. You know, the content writer says, no, you got these sections out of order. You know, I can write in my book, just drag that whole section up. You know, that's done. Go back to my table of contents, layout, update table of contents, yes. Okay, now that hipster Ibsen section's all been renumbered, all the related subsections are all renumbered. I don't need to go through and manually find anything. So that is super, super handy. That is a massive, massive time saver. And so if you don't get into doing table of contents and you're putting together larger books, really be aware of this because, you know, even on a relatively small document like this, it would be hugely time consuming to go through and do that manually. It's a little limited in terms of your styling, but you know, I think for the most part, you can get everything done with space after as indents. Got a nice clean, you know, no extra paragraph breaks needed. Everything's just done with a single tab, all defined in our paragraph styles. So the last but not least part of this too is that when you are generating your table of contents, you can include in the options here, generate PDF bookmarks. Okay, so what that does is it uses every one of those tagged paragraph styles throughout your document as a hyperlink. So let's say I'm ready to publish this book. Okay, so I'm going to go to my book and I'm going to go export book to PDF. All right, so let's just go up to my demos. See demo PDF, hit save. Okay. What am I doing here? This isn't. That's not what I want. I don't want export to interactive PDF, I want all right, I just said interactive. Just want a regular print. I mean, you can do an interactive, but even for just a regular print, this is pretty typical. Hit save, and we are going to do spreads, but we include bookmarks and hyperlinks. Okay, so I mean, most of the time, it depends if we're designing for interactive, which really, you don't really use InDesign for that. But it is kind of handy sometimes to have a PDF with hyperlinks. So if you include your bookmarks and hyperlinks, each of those table of contents is automatically going to work. So I'm just going to do a super quick export here. So when I go to my table of contents, each of these is now a clickable section. It takes me right there. I mean, it doesn't have a back button or anything like that. It's really, really basic, but you can see how you could use that if you add a little element hyperlink back and then bookmarked it back. You could sort of make a pretty decent navigatable book just from your table of contents, just that easily, and it updates all of those sections. So that's the most basic way to use the table of contents. But another thing that you're going to run into when you're styling up something that's got a lot more variation in styles like magazines or whatever, a lot of times you don't actually want your table of contents to directly reflect what all your style headers are. You know, sometimes you're going to use your H2 and your H3 for something that you wouldn't want in your table of contents. So this is a little workaround that I like to do, and this relates directly to in the table of contents here, there was the include book documents, but include text on hidden layers, okay? So I don't have anything on a hidden layer right now, but let's go down to a section. Let's go to this, to the hipster Ipsum section, which is now here. I probably shouldn't have named those by number. I should have named what they're called, but whatever. It's just placeholder text. Okay, so let's say I didn't want my subsections to follow this exactly. So I can create a layer. My layers window. And typically my layers would be a little more complex than this. It'd have a text layer and an image layer to basics, but this is just a real placeholder demo. So I'm just going to call this TOC tags. And I'm just going to show the layer for now, because I want to go through and be able to tag those specific things to what I want to see. Now, because I've overridden the styles, I can use the same H1, H2. But maybe I want to include more text in the, hipster Ipsum, a breakdown of how to put placeholder text using hipster terminology, which I just generated off a website called hipsum.co. It's kind of funny. But anyways, I'm just going to add a text object here on that layer. So let's just say that's what I wanted to show in my table of contents, which would be a little bit different. This is not super common. Like, this isn't really the best example, but you can totally see in your layouts that often you're going to use styles that are not tagged to it. So in that particular case, now we're going to go back and redefine it, and I'm actually only going to use my table of content styles. So instead of tagging this with H1 section title, I'm going to call it TOC H1. So now it's going to read that. This is off my layout and I can hide it. It's just TOC tags. What's important to make it work is that the text object has to be touching the pasteboard. If it's just kind of floating out here in the slug area, it's not going to register it as being part of the document. So the text object that contains the text does need to be touching the pasteboard. And you can hide it, but I mean, because it's outside of the spread, if as long as it matches the background, you're not going to see it anyway. So you could leave this on, but as a good best practice, if you're doing this kind of tagging workaround, then you would just hide this. So that's good. So now I'm going to go back to my page that has the table of contents on it. Okay, I'm going to go back to my layout and I'm going to bring up my table of contents styles, and I'm going to change my section title to use the TLC H1. And I'm going to remove this one. And I want to make sure that's at layer 1. Okay, so if I go through and update my table of contents, what's going to happen is it's going to remove all of those H1s, and it's only going to include my TLC H1 here at that level. And I'm going to need to redefine my, I want to make sure I include my H1 underline there. Okay. So now that's just gone through and only recognized that. So I would need to go through and retag all of my sections. But if it's something you want to do where you want a different style and also different text, it's kind of more of a manual way of tagging up the sections. And I find that in newsletters and stuff like that, that ends up being quite commonly necessary to do. It just gives you a little more control over what shows up. But if it's a more simple, straightforward document like this, then you can just apply the paragraph style directly, automatically use all of your inline copy to go through and generate your table of contents, and it really speeds that up. So it's a super handy tool. Hopefully that kind of covers all of it in about the most generic and direct way that I can think to present it.